The morning of November 4th, 1970, was unremarkable in every way. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and the social workers of Los Angeles County settled into the familiar rhythm of a routine day. They had no idea that within hours, they would be face to face with the worst case of abuse in American history. But in an instant, the mundane rhythm of office life was shattered, replaced by a horror so profound, it would stop everyone in their tracks. The door swung open and a woman walked in. But it wasn't the woman who stole the air from the room. It was the child beside her. The little girl was so emaciated, so disheveled and frail, that the workers initially assumed she was a homeless waif. But the truth they were about to uncover was far, far worse than a simple case of homelessness. This child's story would become one of the most deeply disturbing and widely examined cases of child abuse in American history. It was a story so shocking that even hardened professionals, who worked with the most vulnerable every day, were left feeling physically ill and emotionally shattered. Today we delve into the heartbreaking odyssey of Genie Wiley, a girl who spent the vast majority of her childhood imprisoned in a single dark room, completely isolated from the world and systematically brutalized by the very people who were supposed to be her protectors. As Genie stood before the social workers, she appeared to be about 6 or 7 years old. But there was something profoundly wrong. Her body was hunched, her hands held in front of her like limp paws, a posture eerily reminiscent of a rabbit. Despite her apparent youth, she was minuscule and fragile. Her condition had etched a haunting age onto her features. It was instantly clear that a terrible calamity had befallen this child. Her condition was a catalog of medical mysteries. She was utterly mute, capable of only a few garbled noises. She was incontinent, unable to control her most basic bodily functions. Her eyes couldn't focus, her arms couldn't fully extend, and she seemed incapable of registering the sensation of heat or cold. But the most bizarre and unsettling detail was her mouth. She had what appeared to be 2 full sets of teeth, a condition known as hyperdontia. This made eating and even swallowing a monumental struggle, leaving her in a constant state of drooling. To compound the tragedy, this seemingly young girl was, in fact, 13 years old, and she weighed a mere 59 pounds. The entire chain of events was a tragic accident waiting to happen. Genie's mother, who suffered from severe cataracts and relied on a walking stick, had intended to visit the department that handled services for the blind. In a twist of fate that may have been the only mercy in Genie's life, she mistakenly wandered into the child welfare office. That wrong turn would ultimately shatter the walls of Genie's silent nightmare. I first encountered Genie's story years ago, and it has haunted me ever since. Her situation was so incredibly tragic. It left an indelible scar on my memory, and once you hear the full extent of it, you will understand why. The name Genie was not her real name. It was a pseudonym given to her in the 1970s to shield her identity from the public. Her birth name, Susan, was revealed years later. But for the purposes of this narrative, I will continue to call her Genie. Her mother, Dorothy Irene Wiley, known as Irene, had come to apply for a disability pension. But that mission was instantly sidelined as the social worker's attention was consumed by the condition of the little girl. Her state was so dire that they rushed her to the Los Angeles Children's Hospital. An emergency search of the family home unveiled horrors that no one could have braced themselves for. Genie had spent her entire childhood imprisoned in a dark, minuscule room. She had never been socialized, never attended school, and had never received a single ounce of affection or love, the very nutrients a child needs to grow and thrive. Instead, she was left to wither in a complete vacuum of sensory, emotional, and cognitive stimulation. When the authorities and medical professionals began to intervene, they were deeply traumatized by the sheer severity of what they uncovered. Her father, Clark Wiley, was a cruel and brutal man who kept his daughter confined in homemade straitjackets. During the day, she was strapped to a potty chair, and at night, she was locked in a crib that had been wrapped in chicken wire, like an animal in a cage. She would often be left for days in her own soiled diapers. Clark had a pathological hatred of noise. If Genie made even the slightest sound, he would bark at her like a dog or beat her with a piece of wood. He had even covered the windows of her room with aluminum foil, plunging it into a darkness as absolute as a coal mine. blocking out the very light of day. Simply stepping into that room was enough evidence for the police to arrest Clark Wiley for child abuse. When they asked him why he had kept his daughter in such conditions, his only response was a chilling, "No comments." Genie's story spread like wildfire, and people immediately drew comparisons to a famous case from 19th century France. A boy named Victor had been found living feral in the wilderness. Like Genie, he lacked socialization, speech, and even the most basic human skills. Victor was seen as a rare, scientific opportunity to study human nature in its rawest form, stripped of culture and society. Genie's case would soon become just as famous, but for a far more sinister reason. As you can imagine, this was an incredibly rare and horrifying opportunity for researchers. It wasn't something anyone would ever purposely create. It's difficult to picture what such a child would actually be like. If you're like me, you might imagine someone like Mowgli from the Jungle Book. But let me read you an excerpt describing Victor when he was brought to the National Institute for the Deaf. He was described as a raging, spitting, snarling, filthy savage, defecating where he was, urinating where he was, biting, covered in scars, long hair, yellow teeth, long fingernails. The director had never witnessed anything like it. Now that researchers had a chance to see what a human being would be like without society, a profound question emerged. Could a wild child like this ever be civilized? Some doctors believed Victor was intellectually disabled from birth, while others argued his delays were a direct result of his years in the wild. One young physician, Jean-Marc Itard, was convinced he could teach Victor and bring him into the fold of humanity. His meticulous documentation of his work with the boy would become one of the most famous case studies in history. But what about Genie? How did she end up in such horrific conditions at the hands of her own parents? Unlike Victor, she didn't stumble out of a forest. She grew up in a quiet, unassuming suburb in Temple City, California. To understand the depths of her tragedy, we have to go back to the very beginning, and even further, to understand the man who built her prison. Let me introduce you to Clark Wiley, Genie's father. This is not to excuse his monstrous actions, but to understand the factors that shaped him. Clark was actually born Pearl Wiley in 1901 in Oregon. For the first few years of his life, he lived in the brothels run by his mother. His father was absent, and he was relentlessly teased for his feminine name, spending most of his time isolated and alone, a childhood he would come to deeply resent. Clark bounced between foster homes in the Pacific Northwest. As an adult, he legally changed his name to Clark and re-established a relationship with his mother. But the scars of his early years ran deep. For the rest of his life, he was obsessively devoted to her, even turning a room in his house into a shrine in her memory. Clark worked as a machinist on aircraft assembly lines in Los Angeles. In 1944, he married Irene Oglesby, a woman who had moved from Oklahoma to find work. Irene had a loving relationship with her own father, but her mother was strict and emotionally distant. As a young woman, Irene suffered a severe head injury in an accident, leading to long-term neurological damage and progressive vision loss. By 1970, she was almost completely blind. At the time of their marriage, Irene was in her early 20s, and Clark, 20 years her senior, was intensely controlling. He ruled the household with an iron fist, even keeping a gun on his lap. Irene would later say that her life ended the day she married him. Clark made it brutally clear he did not want children. Yet, despite this, Irene became pregnant multiple times, giving birth to 4 children. Their first, a baby girl, died of pneumonia at 2 months old after being left in a cold garage because Clark couldn't stand her crying. Their second, a boy named Robert, also died under mysterious circumstances. A third son, John, survived, but was severely neglected and developmentally delayed. Finally, 5 years later, on April 18, 1957, Genie was born, though her delivery was complicated and required a blood transfusion. In 1958, tragedy struck again. Clark's mother was killed by a drunk driver. At the time, 6-year-old John had been living with her because she believed Clark was mentally unstable. John and his grandmother were buying ice cream when a pickup truck careened onto the sidewalk and struck her. The driver received only probation, a miscarriage of justice that ignited a fury in Clark. He began to further isolate his family. To compound the horror, he blamed his 6-year-old son for his mother's death, and John was forced to return to his parents' home. After his mother's death, Clark moved the family into her small 2-bedroom house in Temple City. Her passing sent him into a spiraling pit of paranoia and rage. He quit his job and severed all ties with the outside world, becoming increasingly violent and abusive toward his wife and children, who were now effectively prisoners in their own home. Irene would later describe him during this period as a paranoid, violent psychopath. His most venomous anger was reserved for Genie, whom he believed was mentally disabled. When she was just 20 months old, he began locking her away in that dark, isolated room. Neighbors rarely saw the family. The house was tiny, just 2 rooms. One was a shrine to Clark's dead mother. The other was Genie's prison. This meant that Clark, Irene, and John all slept in the living room. Clark in a recliner, Irene in a chair, and John on the floor. When Clark did interact with Genie, it was to bark or growl at her. No one was allowed to speak to her. She was perpetually restrained, either in her homemade straitjacket or strapped to the potty chair, making movement nearly impossible. Communication was a whisper, and she was almost never exposed to normal conversation. To terrorize her further, Clark would stand outside her door, growling and scratching at it like a wild animal. Can you imagine the sheer unrelenting terror of that existence? Genie's cognitive and visual development were profoundly stunted. Her room was her entire universe, so her eyes could not learn to focus beyond 12 feet. Her senses were so understimulated that she barely understood how to use them. Occasionally, she was allowed to play with 2 plastic raincoats or stare at an old TV guide, which constituted the entirety of her playtime. She subsisted on a liquid diet, baby food, cereal, and the occasional hard-boiled egg. Clark demanded she eat quickly and silently. Her brother John was forced to feed her in absolute silence, and if she choked or spit out her food, he was made to rub it in her face. There is also evidence suggesting sexual abuse may have been part of her ordeal, based on her later, inappropriate behaviors toward men, though this remains a point of contention. After years of living in fear and with her own eyesight failing, Irene finally found a sliver of courage. In 1970, she walked into that welfare office, seeking a disability pension. That's when the authorities began their investigation into Clark and Irene for child abuse. Sadly, Clark Wiley never faced justice. On November 20th, 1970, the first day of his trial, he took his own life with a gunshot. He left a note by his feet that read, "The world will never understand," along with instructions for his funeral clothes. He also left a note for his son, John, that said, "Be a good boy, I love you," and included $400. The charges against Irene were dropped when it was revealed that she too was a victim of Clark's abuse and suffered from her own mental health issues. Irene later explained that shortly after Genie's birth, a doctor had told Clark she was severely delayed and wouldn't live long. Clark told her that if Genie somehow made it to 12, then they would seek help. When Genie miraculously reached that age, Clark reneged on his promise. It wasn't until he threatened to kill Genie that Irene finally fled with her daughter to her parents' house. A few days later, she went to the welfare office seeking help. After being taken to UCLA's Children's Hospital, Genie became a ward of the state. The doctors were horrified at the extent of her damage, describing her as the most profoundly disturbed child they had ever encountered. One of the most chilling effects of her abuse was that she seemed incapable of crying. The monumental question became, could she be helped? Could she ever recover? This marked the beginning of a long, difficult, and ethically complex journey to rehabilitate Genie. Between 1971 and 1975, the National Institute of Mental Health funded a major scientific project to study Genie. The team aimed to explore the consequences of extreme isolation and determine if, with an enriched environment, she could overcome her deficits and acquire language, despite having missed the critical developmental window. The team was a constellation of experts, pediatricians, psychologists, linguists, each eager to study how extreme deprivation affects the human brain, particularly its capacity for language. Among them were psychologist David Rigler, linguist Susan Curtis, psychologist James Kent, and psychiatrist Jay Shirley, an authority on social isolation. Dr. Shirley would later state that Genie's case was the worst he had ever seen. What they discovered was that Genie had a rudimentary understanding of some words like blue, orange, mother, and door. She could also utter a few like go, stop it, sorry, and no more. Imagine the profound sadness of that. Sorry, stop it, no more were among the first words she learned to speak. Most of the time, however, she remained in a world of silence. When stressed or excited, she would lose control of her bladder or bowels. Because she couldn't speak, it was difficult to assess her intellect. But it soon became clear she was capable of understanding. She could express fear and anger, and surprisingly, she could laugh. Her laughter was so pure and contagious, it filled the room with a much-needed lightness. Unfortunately, her anger was always turned inward. She would silently scratch her own face and arms. The team worked tirelessly to teach her healthier outlets, to throw a tantrum, slam a door, or throw an object, anything to stop her from harming herself. Linguist Susan Curtis explained that language and thought are separate. For most of us, thoughts are verbally encoded. For Genie, they were not. Yet, she was incredibly intelligent in other ways. She could arrange a set of pictures to tell a coherent story and construct complex structures with sticks. Her team realized that the lights were still on in her mind, even if she couldn't communicate in the typical way. At the time, the scientific study of language was undergoing a revolution. And to linguists, Genie was a blank slate, a unique opportunity to study how language acquisition shapes human development. One of the first challenges was determining whether her delays were caused by the abuse or if she had been born with them. Solitary confinement is one of the harshest punishments known, and its effects are swift. Trauma symptoms can appear in as little as 15 minutes. Imagine the catastrophic impact of 10 years. Dr. Shirley wanted to see the effects on Genie's brain. For 4 nights, they monitored her brain's electrical activity while she slept, finding an unusually high number of sleep spindles. Sleep is critical for memory, learning, and recovery, and these spindles are linked to neuroplasticity. While children with neurodevelopmental disorders often show abnormal spindles, it still didn't answer the core question: nature or nurture. Dr. James Kent believed that forming attachments was the key. He was convinced that if Genie could learn to connect with others, she would have the capacity to learn. For about a month, there was little change, but then, one day, as Dr. Kent was leaving, Genie's face fell into an expression of pure sadness, and she reached out and held his hand to stop him. This small, silent act was a beacon of hope for the team. By spring, Genie had learned over 100 words, and by the end of May, she was beginning to echo words spoken around her. Her progress was rapid and encouraging. By her 3rd day at the hospital, she was helping to dress herself and using the toilet. Over the following months, she learned to bathe and dress herself and discovered a profound love for classical music. Her vocabulary expanded, she picked up basic sign language, and she began sketching pictures to express what words could not. On some intelligence tests, she gained a year's worth of development in just months. For example, she could bathe at the level of a 9-year-old. Yet, in other areas, progress was agonizingly slow. She still chewed food like a 1-year-old. She developed a love for shopping, bright colors, and collecting plastic beach buckets, which she kept by her bed. The team suspected this affinity for plastic was a link to the only toys she'd ever known: the 2 plastic raincoats in her room. For Genie, plastic meant play. She also demonstrated an understanding of object permanence, the concept that things continue to exist even when out of sight, a milestone typically reached by age 2. She grasped peekaboo and deferred imitation, mimicking behaviors she'd seen earlier, like barking like a dog. She even began to understand that others might have different perspectives. The team started to believe a full recovery might be possible, but they were deeply divided on the approach. Should they prioritize her therapeutic needs or the scientific research? Some argued that the knowledge gained could help countless other deprived children. Could Genie truly catch up despite her late start? For decades, a prevailing theory held that children couldn't acquire language after puberty. Linguist Noam Chomsky argued that language is an innate genetic capability. Neuropsychologist Eric Lenneberg added to this, proposing the critical period hypothesis, the idea that if a first language isn't learned by puberty, it may be too late. Genie's case was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to test this theory. And, as it turned out, her burning curiosity and desire to name the world around her suggested that language wasn't out of her reach. Susan Curtis had a vivid memory from those early months of a kind butcher who would visit. He never asked her name or her story, but they communicated nonetheless. He'd slide open the window and hand her something, a bone, a piece of fish, and let her explore it with her hands, as if she were experiencing the world for the first time through touch. The team found that while Genie was highly communicative, grammar and sentence structure were a monumental hurdle. It became clear that if a child isn't exposed to grammar between the ages of 5 and 10, it becomes an alien, incomprehensible concept. Still, she could communicate her thoughts in simple, poignant phrases. Applesauce buys store. She couldn't form a full sentence, but she began to describe her abuse. Father hit arm, big wood, Genie cry. The picture she painted was horrific. For 4 years, Genie was the center of her researchers' lives, which raised serious ethical questions. How involved should they become? Where was the line between professional and personal? In 1971, Genie went to live with one of her teachers, Jean Butler, who had permission to provide her with a home environment for socialization. It was during this time that Genie's body began showing signs of puberty, a clear sign her physical health was improving. The atrophy in her legs began to reverse as she was finally allowed to run and play. But things soon soured. Jean Butler began to restrict access to Genie, claiming the other researchers were subjecting her to too much testing. She even applied to become Genie's foster parent, a bid that was ultimately rejected. Her team would later accuse Butler of trying to become the next Anne Sullivan, the legendary teacher of Helen Keller. After this failed arrangement, Genie went to live with another team member, family therapist Dr. David Rigler, and this placement seemed to offer a semblance of stability and family life. Dr. Rigler recalled a touching moment when a young boy, seeing Genie, silently handed her his toy fire truck without a word. He said Genie never asked for it, yet she seemed to communicate in a way that was almost telepathic. The team began to feel Genie was a powerfully intuitive, non-verbal communicator. While Susan Curtis focused on her language, Dr. James Kent worked on her emotional development. Genie was enrolled in a nursery school, and later a public school for special needs children, where she could interact with peers. She was thriving. She developed a good sense of humor and learned practical skills like ironing and sewing. In the summer of 1972, while shopping with Susan Curtis, Genie turned to her and uttered 2 simple, monumental words: "Genie happy." Around this time, Genie's mother, Irene, had her eyesight restored through cataract surgery and moved back into the family home. She continued to visit Genie, but felt increasingly unwelcome, sensing the team's judgment and resentment for her passive role in the abuse. When the federal funding for Genie's study ended in 1975, she was returned to the custody of her mother, a decision that shocked many as it meant sending her back to the very scene of her torture. In 1979, Irene filed a lawsuit against the hospital and the researchers, alleging they had exploited Genie for their own prestige and profit. The suit was settled in 1984, and all contact between Genie and her dedicated team was severed. When caring for Genie became too difficult, Irene placed her in a series of foster homes, a decision that proved catastrophic. Her first foster home was run with military discipline, a brutal environment for someone with Genie's fragile psyche. For 18 months, she endured further mistreatment. As a result, Genie's progress came to a screeching halt. She turned inward, shutting out the world, even trying to hold in her own bowel movements. She didn't speak a single word for 5 months. Susan Curtis was the only team member to visit her, her care for Genie undiminished, even though she was no longer being paid. Genie eventually ended up back in the hospital, severely malnourished. Her situation only worsened. After incidents of being beaten, she became so terrified of speaking that she regressed into complete silence. She was then shuffled through a series of state-run institutions. Psychiatrist Jay Shirley, who visited her on her 27th and 29th birthdays, found her silent, depressed, and chronically institutionalized. He poignantly said, "She was this isolated person, incarcerated for all those years. She emerged and lived in a more reasonable world for a while, responded to this world, and then the door was shut, and she withdrew again." Her soul was sick. Genie's brother John lived a very different but equally scarred life. He too was a victim of his father's abuse. He said, "My house was like a concentration camp. I never knew what normal was." He spent his life trying to recover. In a 2008 interview, he told ABC News, "I was left out in left field, and no one came to my rescue." He last saw Genie in 1982. He spoke openly about his struggles with alcoholism, divorce, and estrangement from his own daughter. "I have forgiven," he said, "but I can't forget." After his father's death, John drifted through life, working odd jobs, joining the Navy briefly, before eventually settling in Ohio as a house painter. He managed to build a family and find a measure of peace. "I don't have the hurt I used to have," he said, "and I'm happy for my sister for getting all the attention. I'm alive, and I'm able to enjoy a lot of things." John passed away in 2011. Irene passed away in 2003. As of 2008, Genie's whereabouts were unknown, but it is believed she is living in a private, assisted living facility for adults in Los Angeles. She would have turned 67 in April 2024. The story of Genie Wiley is a complex and tragic tapestry of human cruelty and failed responsibility. The doctors and researchers never fully answered the question of whether her delays were innate or the result of her abuse. But what we do know is heartbreaking. The fact that she had begun to babble and produce words before her imprisonment suggests her development was on a normal trajectory, a trajectory her father's unspeakable cruelty brutally halted. But the focus should not be on that single, unanswerable question. The true overarching tragedy is that she was a young girl who endured unimaginable suffering, and the world around her, her family, and even the scientific community meant to help her, ultimately failed to provide the unconditional protection and care she so desperately needed. It is a hard truth that the researchers, despite their good intentions, found themselves in a morally gray area, caught between the noble goal of helping one child and the broader ambition of gathering knowledge that could help countless others. Perhaps, had there been a neutral advocate solely dedicated to Genie's welfare, a person to put her needs above all else, the outcome might have been profoundly different. It's a heavy, tragic story, and one that continues to resonate as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the enduring fragility of the human spirit.